Why did the bullet arrive before the fear? Sarah felt the pressure before the sound. A violent push of air beside her head, close enough to move her hair, close enough to steal breath. Then the crack followed, sharp, final. Her body reacted before her mind did, hands scraping gravel as she dropped and rolled toward the low concrete barrier at the roof's edge. The city below waited like a mouth. 6 stories down. No margin. "Sniper northeast," someone yelled, panic breaking through discipline. Sarah pressed herself flat, heart already slowing into focus. The sound told her everything: distance, elevation, patience. Whoever was shooting knew what they were doing. She peeked just enough to confirm what her instincts already knew. 3rd floor, roughly 400 meters. Sunlight kissed the edge of a rifle barrel for half a second. That was all she needed. Protocol whispered in her ear. Don't act, don't lead, observe, advise, assist. She ignored it. Because Specialist Kowalski, their designated marksman, was frozen behind a vent, hands shaking, rifle useless, fear louder than training. Another round smacked concrete inches from Sarah's face, sending stone chips across her cheek. The shooter was walking his shots closer. 45 minutes, command said when she called it in. Hold position. 45 minutes meant half of them wouldn't leave this roof alive. Sarah looked around at the soldiers pinned beside her, young, tired, trusting a system that had already failed them today. She felt something familiar rise in her chest, not anger, not fear. Responsibility. They hadn't sent just an advisor, they sent her, and no one here knew who she really was. Not yet. Give me the rifle, she said calmly. The words landed harder than gunfire. She took the M110 from trembling hands and felt her stomach tighten. The scope was cracked, distorted, broken. Around her, doubt spread like cold. That's it, someone muttered. We're done. Sarah didn't argue, she didn't explain. She removed the scope and flipped up the iron sights instead. The rifle suddenly looked naked, primitive, outmatched. And for the first time since the shots began, she felt fear, not of dying but of missing, of failing people who had no idea how much they were trusting her. She knelt behind a shattered vent, breathed, and let the noise fade. She remembered a voice from years ago, gravelly, unforgiving. Technology fails, fundamentals don't. Her world narrowed to wind, distance, breath. When Webb tossed his helmet as distraction, Sarah fired. Once. Silence followed. No return fire, no movement. Seconds stretched thin enough to snap. Then the radio confirmed what her instincts already knew. Target down. Relief didn't feel triumphant, it felt heavy. Because now they would look at her differently. And that would change everything. Why did no one cheer? The rooftop didn't erupt the way movies said it should. There was no celebration, just disbelief followed by movement. Training kicked back in, overriding shock. Packs tightened. Weapons scanned. Sarah was already on her feet. Move now. She didn't wait for agreement. They cleared the roof fast, descended the stairwell, spilled into the broken city below. Dust hung in the air like memory. The streets of Mass were quieter than they should have been, the kind of quiet that meant eyes were watching from behind curtains and shattered windows. Sarah took rear security, senses stretched thin. Behind her, Webb kept glancing back, trying to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed that morning with the one who just saved them. At the extract point, when engines finally arrived, adrenaline drained all at once. Knees shook, hands trembled, laughter escaped where it didn't belong. Survival did that. Later, after reports and debriefs, Webb found her alone. I looked you up, he said. She waited. Your file is redacted, mostly, but enough got through. She met his eyes without flinching. You weren't just an instructor. No. The shot you made, he continued, quieter now, that wasn't luck. She almost smiled, almost. They gave you the worst rifle in inventory, he said, because they thought you wouldn't need it. Sarah cleaned the borrowed rifle in silence that night, every motion practiced, grounding. Her hands remembered things her mind sometimes tried to forget. The message came while she worked. Return to DVGRU. Immediate need. Interested. She stared at the words longer than she expected. She'd left for a reason. Burnout, pressure, the endless proving. But today had reminded her of something simple. When everything fails, this is where she belongs. She typed 2 words. Send details. Why did she refuse the best rifle she'd ever been offered? The armorer looked confused when she handed back the M110 and declined the pristine replacement. This one works, she said simply. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded with quiet respect. Back on base, soldiers stepped aside for her now, not out of fear, out of recognition. Sarah carried the same scratched M4 across the dust. The rifle nobody wanted. The rifle they underestimated. Just like her. She felt no need to correct them anymore. Because dignity doesn't explain itself. It acts. Why did the silence after the shot feel heavier than the gunfire itself? For 3 full seconds no one moved. Not Sarah, not Webb, not the men crouched behind broken concrete and torn ducting. The rooftop, moments ago alive with chaos, felt suddenly hollow, empty, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Sarah kept the rifle shouldered. She didn't exhale, not yet. Experienced shooters knew better than to celebrate a single round. Silence didn't always mean success. Sometimes it meant patience. Sometimes it meant the enemy was waiting for you to relax. Her cheek pressed into the stock, iron sights steady on the same dark rectangle of the 3rd-floor window. She counted heartbeats instead of seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, no answering shot. Behind her, Webb swallowed hard. He's not firing. That doesn't mean he's done, Sarah said quietly. She shifted her weight just enough to ease pressure off her knee. Pain crept in where adrenaline had been doing its job too well. The rooftop gravel bit into her skin, grounding her in the moment. She welcomed it. Pain meant she was still present, still sharp. Her mind replayed the shot in fragments. The wind estimate, the holdover, the way the front sight post had floated slightly left just before the trigger broke. It had felt right, but feeling right wasn't proof. Chen to TOC, she said into the radio, keeping her voice flat. Request drone confirmation. 3rd floor northeast building. Grid follows. The response took longer than she liked. Those seconds stretched thin, filled with the low hum of the city and the distant echo of something breaking far below. Somewhere, civilians were living their lives between moments of violence, unaware how close death had come to spilling onto their streets. Sarah thought of that as she waited. She didn't think of medals, or recognition, or how this would be told later. She thought of the young specialist shaking behind the vent, of Webb's voice cracking when the first shot missed her head by inches, of how quickly confidence evaporated when training met reality. The radio crackled. Romeo 7, thermal shows stationary heat signature, no movement, likely casualty. Likely. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders loosen just a fraction, enough to breathe, not enough to relax. Confirm weight 1, she said. A pause, then, confirmed target down. The words landed quietly. No cheer followed, no whoop, just a collective release of breath that sounded almost like grief. Because they all knew how close it had been. Webb stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as the SEAL advisor, not as the woman he'd dismissed hours earlier, but as the reason his team was still breathing. You made that shot, he said. She lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands were steady now, but inside something fragile trembled, relief, exhaustion, a strange sadness she couldn't quite name. "We need to move," she said, "now." There was no argument this time. They peeled off the rooftop in practiced order, down the stairwell that had been a death trap minutes earlier. The walls were scarred with old impacts, layers of conflict etched into concrete. Sarah brushed her fingers along one as she passed, a habit she didn't remember forming. At street level, the city swallowed them. Urban mass didn't announce danger, it whispered it. Narrow alleys, half-collapsed buildings, windows that watched without revealing who stood behind them. Every step felt borrowed. Sarah took rear security without being asked. The M110 hung heavier now, the weight no longer abstract. Every sense stayed wide open, cataloging sound and shadow. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited. To Coronado, to long days where she'd been the only woman in the room, learning to speak less and observe more. To instructors who tested her harder, whether they admitted it or not. To nights she'd questioned if proving herself was worth the cost. She learned early that competence didn't always earn respect. Sometimes it earned resentment. Sometimes silence was safer. 2 blocks from the extract point, a door creaked open somewhere to their left. Sarah's pulse jumped, rifle rising instinctively, but nothing followed, just a cat slipping into the rubble. They reached the partially collapsed building and took cover. When the QRF vehicles finally arrived, 12 minutes later, the relief was physical, like stepping out of deep water. Inside the armored transport, dust coated everything. Sweat cooled too fast. Hands shook now that there was time for it. No one spoke for the first minute. Then someone laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Someone else joined in quieter. Survival had a strange sense of humor. Sarah leaned back against the cold metal and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge the tremor in her hands, short enough not to let it grow. Back at the forward operating base, routine wrapped around them like a blanket, weapons cleared, reports filed. Language became clinical again, enemy sniper neutralized, rooftop engagement resolved. But clinical words couldn't touch what lingered beneath the surface. Webb waited until the paperwork was done, until the room had emptied. Then he stood in the doorway, unsure. "I looked you up," he said finally. She didn't turn right away. She focused on the sound of solvent on metal as she cleaned the borrowed rifle. "Most of it's redacted," he continued, "but enough was." She met his gaze then, calm, unoffended. "You weren't just an instructor." "No," she said. He exhaled slowly. "That shot 400 meters, iron sights through a window." He shook his head. "That's not something you just do." Sarah considered lying. It would have been easier, but exhaustion stripped pretense away. "I trained for it," she said, "for when things fail." "They gave you the worst rifle in the armory," Webb said, "because they thought you wouldn't need better." She shrugged. "The rifle did its job." "No," he said quietly, "you did." The words hit harder than any compliment she'd received in years. Later, alone in her quarters, Sarah sat on her bunk with the cleaned rifle across her knees. The room was quiet except for distant generators and the occasional shout outside. She should have slept. Instead, she stared at the weapon like it held answers. Her phone buzzed. Encrypted, command level. Outstanding performance. Recommend early rotation back. Unique skill set required. She closed her eyes. She'd left that world because it demanded everything. Time, relationships, pieces of herself she wasn't sure she could keep giving away. But today had reminded her why she joined in the first place. Not for recognition. For moments when training met chaos and made order out of it. She typed her response slowly. "Send details." Outside, the base settled into uneasy sleep. Somewhere beyond the wire, the city continued breathing, unaware of how close it had come to swallowing 6 more names. Sarah lay back, staring at the ceiling, listening to her heartbeat finally return to something like normal. She wondered who she would have to become next, and whether she was ready to carry that weight again. Why did the invitation feel less like an honor, and more like a test she wasn't sure she wanted to pass again? Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, counting the faint vibrations of generators through the concrete floor. Each hum reminded her she was still inside the machine, still useful, still wanted for now. The message from command glowed in her mind even after she locked her phone and slid it under her pillow. Return to DVGRU. Immediate need. Unique skill set required. Unique, that word always came wrapped in expectations. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes, but memory crept in the way it always did when silence lingered too long. Long nights offshore, helicopter rotors chopping darkness into pieces, briefings that never used names, only grids and probabilities, success measured by absence, no headlines, no acknowledgement, no room to fail. She asked to step back for a reason. At first light the base woke slowly, boots on gravel, engines coughing to life. Somewhere nearby, a soldier laughed too loudly, the sound edged with exhaustion. Sarah sat up, swung her feet to the floor, and took a long breath before the day could decide who she needed to be. At the armory, she returned Kowalski's M110. The armorer, a master sergeant with a face carved by decades of heat and bad coffee, took the rifle from her carefully. Not the way you take equipment, the way you take something that's earned a story. Heard about yesterday, he said. Just did my job. He grunted, unconvinced, and disappeared into the back. When he returned, he carried something that didn't belong in this place. Clean lines, perfect glass, an M110A1 pristine. For you, he said, rest of your deployment. Sarah looked at it without touching it. Beautiful weapons had a way of lying. They promised certainty, control. I'll stick with my M4, she said. The armorer studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Respect. That word followed her back across the base. Soldiers who'd barely noticed her before now paused, nodded, asked questions they hadn't thought to ask yesterday. Officers wanted opinions, advice, validation. It unsettled her more than the gunfire had. Respect earned in crisis faded quickly. She'd seen that before, but something else lingered in their eyes now, something quieter. Trust. She spent the morning running drills with a platoon scheduled to rotate out in a week. Young faces, mixed confidence. She corrected stances, adjusted grips, said little. She learned long ago that teaching wasn't about showing how much you knew. It was about giving people something they could carry when you weren't there. During a break, Webb approached her again, slower this time, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're asking for your input on future ops, he said, higher up. She nodded. That happens. You're leaving, he guessed. Maybe. He hesitated. I owe you more than an apology. She shook her head. You owe your people honesty, that's enough. That night the details arrived. The operation wasn't flashy. It never was. A high-value facilitator moving through contested territory under the cover of humanitarian aid convoys. Precision required, discretion demanded, no room for collateral damage, no room for assumptions. They wanted her because she'd proven something yesterday, not just skill, but judgment. She read the briefing twice, then a third time. Old tension stirred. The familiar pull between wanting to protect others and knowing the cost of doing so. She thought of the years she'd spent proving she belonged, of the quiet moments she'd missed back home, of how every deployment asked for more and never offered anything back. By dawn, she'd made her decision. 2 days later, she was airborne. The aircraft was unmarked, the interior stripped down to function. The team around her was small, experienced. No one questioned her presence here. In this room, her reputation preceded her. That should have been comforting. It was. As the rotors beat time above them, Sarah stared at the floor and checked her gear for the third time. Habit, control, something to anchor her. Across from her, the team leader, a man named Reyes, watched her quietly. "You good?" he asked. She met his eyes, always. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. They inserted just before dawn, the world washed in gray. The target area lay quiet, almost peaceful. That worried her more than active resistance ever did. They moved with restraint, not urgency. Sarah took overwatch on a low ridge, scanning with patience earned through years of knowing that rushing was how you missed things. Minutes stretched. Then she saw it. A flicker, wrong angle, a reflection where there shouldn't be one. Her pulse slowed. "Contact possible," she whispered. "Hold." She tracked the movement without lifting her rifle, letting it reveal itself. When the shot finally came, from a position almost identical to the one she'd faced days earlier, she was already ahead of it. The round cracked past her shoulder, close enough to remind her how thin the line still was. "Sniper," she said calmly. "Different building, similar setup." Reyes trusted her without question. "Your call." She didn't rush the shot this time, didn't feel the need to prove anything. She waited for the moment when patience beat precision. When she fired, the outcome felt inevitable. Later, as they exfiltrated clean, the sun finally broke the horizon. Light spilled across the land like forgiveness. In the aircraft on the way out, Reyes sat beside her. "You ever think about stopping?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said finally, "every time." "But you don't." "No." "Why?" She looked at her hands, steady, scarred, honest. "Because when it matters," she said, "someone has to be calm." Back at base days later, paperwork swallowed the operation whole. It would disappear into classified archives, reduced to outcomes and timestamps. Sarah stood outside as the sun dipped low, the same M4 slung over her shoulder. She felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, but she also felt aligned. She knew this pace couldn't last forever. But for now, she was where she was meant to be. Not because she needed the fight, but because sometimes the fight needed her. And she would answer, quietly, completely, until the day she chose not to anymore. Why did the quiet after the second mission feel more dangerous than the gunfire itself? The aircraft touched down without ceremony. No cheers, no handshakes, just boots hitting dirt and the low grind of engines powering down. The mission folded into silence the way it always did, sealed behind classification codes and carefully worded reports. Success, on paper, looked clean. Inside Sarah, it didn't. She walked across the base slower than usual, the weight in her chest unfamiliar. Not fear, not doubt, something heavier, accumulated, like every moment she'd held her breath over the years had finally decided to collect interest. The team dispersed. Reyes gave her a nod that said everything and nothing, respect without expectation. That was rare. She appreciated it more than praise. Back in her quarters, she set the rifle down and sat on the edge of the bunk, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. Her hands were steady. That almost bothered her more than if they were. She remembered a time when coming back from an op meant shaking so badly she had to grip the sink to stay upright. Back when adrenaline still had somewhere to go. Now it just settled, quietly, deep. Her phone buzzed once. Not command this time. It was her sister. "You alive?" Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yeah, still here." There was a pause before the reply came. "Mom asked about you. I told her you're teaching, still true." Sarah stared at the word teaching. It felt like a different lifetime. "Tell her yes," she typed. It was close enough to the truth to pass. She stood, splashed water on her face, studied her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed composed, capable, but behind the eyes something flickered. Fatigue, or maybe the slow erosion that came from being exactly who everyone needed you to be. Over the next weeks, operations blended together. Overwatch, advising, precision work done quietly, efficiently. Her name circulated in rooms she wasn't in. Requests came with increasing frequency. She never asked who declined when she accepted. She noticed things others missed. Not just movement patterns or firing angles, but people who hesitated before speaking, who joked too much, who cleaned their weapon twice as often as necessary. She saw herself in some of them. One afternoon, during a lull between missions, she found Kowalski sitting alone near the motor pool, staring at his boots. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. He startled, then nodded quickly. "Yes, no, I mean." She sat anyway. They didn't speak for a while. Engines roared somewhere nearby. A helicopter lifted off, scattering dust across the concrete. "I froze," he said suddenly, "up on that roof." She waited. "I trained for years," he continued. "Scored high, everyone said I was ready, and then I was." Sarah nodded slowly. "You were." He frowned. "Doesn't feel like it." "Fear doesn't mean failure," she said. "It means you understood the stakes." He swallowed. "You didn't freeze." She looked out across the base. "I did, just earlier in my career, where no one saw." That seemed to settle him. Not comfort exactly, but perspective. As she stood to leave, he said, "Thank you for taking the rifle." She paused. "You'll take it next time." "I don't know if I." "You will," she said, "and you'll remember this feeling. That's what makes you better." That night, she dreamed for the first time in months. Not of gunfire, not of missed shots. She dreamed of water. Cold, endless, pulling her under while voices shouted from above. She kicked, fought, surfaced just long enough to breathe before being dragged back down. She woke up gasping, heart pounding, the room dark and unfamiliar for half a second too long. She sat there until her breathing slowed. This was the cost no briefing mentioned. Not bullets, not wounds, the quiet accumulation of moments your mind hadn't processed yet. The next morning, command called her in. A colonel she'd met only once nodded at her as she entered. "We're rotating you stateside early." Her first reaction was suspicion. Her second was relief. "You've done exceptional work," he continued, "but we think you're nearing the edge of diminishing returns." Burnout, he meant. He didn't say it. "You'll take a training billet, 6 months, maybe longer." She should have felt disappointed. Instead, she felt something loosen in her chest. Back home, the ocean greeted her like an old friend. Coronado smelled the same: salt, sun, memory. She walked the beach at dawn, boots sinking into wet sand, letting waves numb her ankles. She thought about the young woman she'd been when she first arrived here. Determined, angry, quietly defiant. She thought about the woman she was now. At the range, instructors watched her demonstrations with careful attention. Students leaned forward when she spoke, not because she demanded it, but because her words came from experience, not theory. One afternoon, a trainee asked, "How do you make the shot when everything goes wrong?" Sarah considered the question, longer than necessary. "You don't," she said finally. "You make the decision before the shot. The trigger pull is just the result." The words surprised her with their honesty. As weeks passed, the noise inside her began to soften, not disappear, just quiet enough to manage. She slept better, ate slower, learned how to sit with herself without immediately scanning for threats. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, her phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. You still teaching?" the message read. She knew who it was before the second line appeared. "Because we might need calm again." Sarah watched the waves roll in, endless and patient. She thought about rooftops and silence, about rifles without scopes, about people who froze and people who acted. She typed her reply carefully. Send details. Because some people didn't chase danger. They simply answered when it called. And as the last light faded over the Pacific, Sarah understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. Strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about knowing when to step forward and when to breathe, so you could do it again. Why did the call feel different this time? Less urgent, yet somehow heavier. Sarah didn't respond right away. The phone rested face down on the small table beside her chair, vibrating once before going still. The ocean rolled in front of her with indifferent rhythm, waves collapsing and reforming as if nothing in the world ever truly ended. She watched it longer than necessary, letting the sound work on her nerves. Because this time, the call didn't feel like a test of skill. It felt like a test of honesty. She had learned to live without the noise. The first weeks back stateside had been disorienting. No distant explosions, no radios crackling at odd hours, no constant mental math about angles and exits. Silence had felt unnatural at first, like standing in a room where the lights were too bright. But she'd adjusted. She taught now, not just shooting, decision-making, patience, when not to pull the trigger. Her students didn't realize how rare that lesson was. Most of them came in hungry to prove something. She recognized the look. She'd worn it once. The message sat unanswered as she stood and brushed sand from her hands. Because we might need calm again. Calm, they always framed it that way. Not danger, not violence. Calm, as if calm were something you deployed like equipment instead of something you paid for over years. That night she dreamed again, but differently. No gunfire, no drowning. She dreamed of standing in a long hallway lined with doors, each one marked by a date instead of a name. She opened one and saw herself younger, kneeling behind cover, heart racing, trying not to let anyone see her hands shake. She opened another and saw an older version, colder, steadier, pulling a trigger without hesitation. At the end of the hall was a door with no marking at all. She woke before she could open it. By morning the decision still wasn't made, but the avoidance was. She typed her response. Send details. The briefing was minimal. That worried her more than anything else. No long target package, no elaborate contingency trees, just a location, a window of time, and a warning that things were unstable. Not hostile, not friendly. Unstable. The mission wasn't kinetic by design. Advisory again. Overwatch if needed. A fragile negotiation between local forces and a group that didn't trust promises or uniforms. Her presence wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to reassure. On the flight out, she sat beside a woman she hadn't met before. Civilian clothes, calm posture, eyes that missed nothing. Name's Ellen, she said. I talk more than you. Sarah smiled faintly. That's probably useful. Ellen studied her for a moment. They told me you're very good at not escalating things. They exaggerate. No, Ellen said, they rarely do. The insertion was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. Gravel under boots, wind against canvas, a distant dog barking once then stopping. They took positions overlooking a meeting point that looked almost peaceful in daylight. Low buildings, open ground, a place where people once lived normal lives before normal stopped meaning anything. Sarah settled into overwatch, rifle resting but not aimed. She watched body language more than hands, listened for rhythm instead of noise. The meeting began. Words passed back and forth she couldn't hear. Gestures sharpened. Voices rose just enough to register as tension even from this distance. Her finger stayed well clear of the trigger. Then she saw it. A man on the far side of the group, not part of the conversation, not listening. His posture was wrong, too still, too focused elsewhere. His hand drifted toward his waistband, not hurried, not nervous. Decisive. Sarah inhaled slowly. This was the moment they never put in reports. The space between action and restraint, between saving lives and ruining everything. She keyed her mic once, soft. Possible threat, hold. Ellen's voice came back calm. We see him. Seconds stretched. The man's fingers brushed fabric. He glanced toward the negotiators, calculating. Sarah didn't raise the rifle. Instead, she shifted just enough that sunlight caught the barrel. A glint, intentional, visible. The man froze. Their eyes met across distance and consequence. She didn't glare, didn't threaten. She simply watched him, fully, unmistakably. After a long moment, his hand withdrew. He stepped back, melted into the crowd like he'd never existed. The meeting ended soon after, not triumphantly, just intact. Back at their temporary base, Ellen poured 2 cups of bitter coffee and handed one to Sarah. You could have taken the shot, she said. Yes. But you didn't. No. Why? Sarah stared into the cup, watching the surface tremble slightly. Because sometimes people need to know they're seen more than they need to be stopped. Ellen nodded slowly. That's not in any manual. No, Sarah said. It's in consequences. That night, alone again, Sarah sat outside under a sky crowded with stars. The rifle rested beside her, unused. She thought about all the shots she hadn't taken over the years. All the moments restraint had mattered more than precision. She realized something uncomfortable. Those moments were heavier, harder. Anyone could pull a trigger under pressure. Living with the choice not to, that took something else entirely. The debrief the next day was short. Successful outcome, no engagement, mission complete. Command seemed almost disappointed. On the flight home, Ellen leaned over. You ever think about what happens when you stop answering the calls? Sarah didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. And I think the world keeps going. Ellen smiled. Good answer. Back in Coronado, Sarah returned to her routine. Teaching, running the beach at dawn, learning how to be present without scanning every horizon. Weeks passed. One afternoon, a trainee froze on the firing line, rifle wavering, breath shallow. The range went quiet. Sarah stepped in front of him, blocking the target. Hey, she said gently, look at me. He did, eyes wide, embarrassed. You don't have to shoot, she said, not yet. But everyone's watching. They'll still be watching if you rush and miss. He swallowed, lowered the rifle, took a breath. When he finally fired, the shot was clean. Later he thanked her. She told him not to. That evening, as the sun bled into the ocean, Sarah sat on the same stretch of sand where she'd received the message weeks earlier. The phone was quiet now. No calls. No requests. She felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Contentment maybe, or acceptance. She understood now that her strength had never been about how well she shot, or how calm she looked under fire. It was about discernment, about knowing when action mattered and when presence was enough. Somewhere out there, chaos would always exist. People would always make choices that required others to respond. But she didn't have to be the answer every time. As the waves rolled in, steady and unremarkable, Sarah let herself sit with that truth. Because sometimes, resilience wasn't about standing firm against the storm. It was about knowing when to step back, and trusting that calm, once taught, could exist without you holding the line. Why did the quiet finally feel earned instead of borrowed? Sarah noticed it on a morning that looked like every other. The sun rose without drama. The ocean breathed in its slow, patient rhythm. The base woke up the same way it always did, boots on concrete, distant voices, metal doors opening and closing. Nothing was different. Except her. She stood on the beach longer than usual, shoes in hand, feet sinking into wet sand. The cold water curled around her ankles and retreated, again and again, as if testing whether she would follow. For years she had, toward noise, toward urgency, toward the unspoken belief that if she didn't show up, something terrible would happen. Now, the world seemed to be proving otherwise. Her phone stayed silent, not ominously silent, just quiet, no alerts, no encrypted numbers, no carefully worded requests that pretended to be optional. The absence didn't scare her the way it once would have. It felt like space, like room to breathe. At the range later that morning, she watched from the sidelines as a group of trainees rotated through drills. She wasn't instructing today, just observing. It was harder than she expected. Letting go always was. She saw mistakes before they happened, shoulders tightening, breaths shortening, the subtle tells of someone pushing past their limits because they thought that was what strength looked like. More than once, she had to stop herself from stepping in. They needed to learn without her hands, guiding every movement. One of the instructors leaned over. "You okay just watching?" Sarah nodded. "They are." It was true, and it mattered. During lunch, she sat alone, something she'd once avoided. Silence had used to feel like an accusation. Now it felt neutral, honest. She caught herself smiling faintly at nothing in particular. That afternoon, she received a message, not from Command but from Webb. He didn't waste words. "Kowalski passed sniper school, top third, wanted me to tell you." Sarah read it twice. "Good," she typed back. "He earned it." There was a pause before the reply. "We all did, because you didn't do it for us. You showed us how to do it ourselves." She set the phone down slowly. That night she dreamed again. This time there were no doors, no hallways, no water pulling her under. She dreamed of standing on a rooftop but not under fire. The city below was quiet, the sky clear. She held a rifle with no optic, no attachments, simple, functional, enough. She didn't fire. She woke before dawn with a sense of closure she couldn't quite explain. The invitation to speak came a week later. Not a briefing, a talk, a room full of instructors and operators preparing to rotate out. They wanted lessons learned, best practices, wisdom, someone had called it, half joking. She almost declined. But something told her this wasn't about missions. When she stood in front of them, she didn't talk about marksmanship, or wind calls, or angles. She talked about hesitation, about doubt, about the moment when you realize no one is coming to make the decision for you. "I've taken shots that mattered," she said evenly, "and I've held back when it would have been easier not to. Both leave marks." The room stayed quiet. "The hardest part isn't pulling the trigger," she continued. "It's living with why you did or didn't." Someone asked how she stayed calm. She thought of rooftops, of cracked scopes, of moments where everything could have ended differently. "I don't," she said. "I just don't let fear decide for me." Afterward, a young woman approached her, new, nervous, determined in a way that felt familiar. "They told me you don't need the best gear to be effective," she said. Sarah smiled gently. "Gear helps, but it won't save you when you hesitate." The woman nodded, absorbing that. "What will?" she asked. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Knowing who you are before it matters." That evening, Sarah packed a small bag, nothing official, no checklist, just the basics. She drove north along the coast, windows down, letting salt air fill the car. The road unwound ahead of her without urgency. She stopped at a quiet overlook as the sun dipped low, sat on the hood of the car and watched the horizon swallow light. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something. Her phone buzzed once. "Ellen, you done saving the world?" Sarah smiled. "Never was," she typed back, "just helping it breathe sometimes." There was no reply. That felt right. When darkness settled, Sarah stayed where she was, wrapped in a jacket, listening to waves crash far below. She thought about the rifle still locked in the armory, the scratched M4 that had done its job without ceremony, the borrowed weapon that had taught people more about her than she'd ever intended. She understood now that the rifle had never been the point. Neither had the shot. What mattered was what happened after, how people carried themselves once the noise faded, how they treated the next challenge when no one was watching, how they decided who they wanted to be when fear arrived early and left late. She drove back under a sky scattered with stars, feeling something close to peace. Not because she was done, but because she no longer needed to prove that she was. The next morning she turned down a request without guilt. The one after that, too, not because she couldn't do the job, but because someone else could and needed the chance. She returned to the range later that week, not as an instructor, but as a quiet presence, a reminder that capability didn't need to announce itself. As the sun set behind the hills, Sarah watched a group of trainees clean their weapons, laughing softly, unaware of how close some of them had come to quitting weeks earlier. She saw confidence growing, not loud, not reckless, but grounded. She felt proud in a way that surprised her. Not of herself, of them. And as she walked away, boots crunching on gravel, she understood the truth that had taken her years to accept. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition or perfect conditions. It doesn't depend on the newest rifle, the clearest scope, or the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes strength waits. Sometimes it endures being underestimated. Sometimes it acts once, quietly, decisively, and then steps back so others can step forward. Because dignity doesn't explain itself. It doesn't argue. It doesn't need permission. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts.